Hello, we're back. And in this video lecture, we're going to be talking about change management. Change is huge in healthcare, and nowhere is it more prevalent than in health information management. Between the installation, upgrade, and maintenance of electronic health record systems, changing to new vendors and other things, change is going to be with us for some time in healthcare, and particularly in health information management. Let's have a look at some highlights of change management. Okay, as mentioned, this is involving change management, chapter 5. And again, with change management, some of the things that we're looking at are how we do strategic planning and organizational development. Health information looks dramatically different than it did when I started many years ago. We've gone from being paper-based and having job titles and job skills, particularly tied to such things as transcription, typing, filing, sorting documents, to electronic data management. And one of the things that is useful is to have some sort of strategic plan, these types of plans that go over a longer time frame. So if we start with a plan, we need to look at things that are impacting the organization. And in health information management, in the last several years, this included such things as updates to the HIPAA privacy rule, new electronic health records, and ICD-10 implementation, right? We need to have new strategies on how to deal with this. Some organizations using electronic health records now require physicians to pick diagnostic labels that map back to a code instead of having coders do it, and then the coders go and edit it before the claims and codes are submitted, right? When that doesn't work, sometimes they go back. So we're always having these kind of new strategies. And then to see if the strategies are working, we need to have some sort of measures and targets. Otherwise, we'll never know if we're meeting what we set out to do. And then once we do that, we need to assess whether we met them, didn't meet them, or maybe we didn't track them for other reasons. And then we reevaluate them and go back to the plan. It's fine to have plans that involve coding or electronic health records, but it should tie back to the mission and vision of the organization. The mission is basically why the organization exists. The vision is where we'd like to be in the idealized state. And then everything that we do in terms of strategic planning, short-term planning, decision-making, and organizational development should cascade up to the mission and the vision. Some of the roles in strategic planning include such things as parsing out strategic information. And when we look at these, a lot of people get confused between what is the long-term strategy and what is the day-to-day operations. There should be some consistency, but the strategy is thinking about what we're going to do, and the day-to-day operations is dealing with things that are immediately important at that day. We want to encourage employees to use existing technology effectively rather than their time-honored methods. Some examples of this that we see at our own community college are operations specialists who maintain manual files instead of maintaining electronic ones. So of course, when we get it to this point, we have to have change management. Your text talks about change agents and internal and external change agents. And I'm not going to delve into that, but what I would like to talk about a little bit is, what do you need to be an effective change management? For one, you need broad knowledge, not just specifically about health information management, but how that health information management is used in other related departments. That means patient care providers. That means billing, finance, planning, utilization management, all these different types of things. You need both operational and relational knowledge because, again, one of the things that we need to look at are the workflows, in other words, the steps to get things across. And then finally, last two bullet points deal with interpersonal skills. You need to be both sensitive and mature. People have a natural inclination to resist change, and you have to be sensitive enough to listen to them, but mature enough to be able to move the process along. And then lastly, you need to be authentic. You need to be truthful. Otherwise, if you're not authentic, people are not going to trust your message about change. I'm going to move ahead to some tactics in terms of overcoming obstacles in change. And a lot of times when you want to implement a new system, people will come up with all the reasons why it won't work. And some things that you need to look at are to identify, frame, and solve the problem, right? The other thing we want to do is to wait for a solution. Some of these problems are self-limiting. Some of them go away, right? So sometimes people say we don't have room for a network server because we need room for files. However, disk space is a lot more cost effective in terms of space than paper file cabinets or cabinets to hold these paper files. So a lot of times these solutions present themselves in the course of the implementation. The other thing is to collaborate and learn from change. There'll always be the unexpected things. We'll have to be able to work with all parties to get to the solution. Your text talks about the adoption of change. I think most of these are kind of self-evident, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. And again, change management, pretty straightforward. I'll let you delve into that. But now I want to talk about some theories about change management. This one is from Lewin, talking about the 3 stages of change management: the unfreezing, the transitioning, and the refreezing, right? So in other words, when you're telling a medical office you're going to an electronic health record, you have to unfreeze their ties to the paper chart world. You have to transition them. And then in time, they refreeze again until such time as you come up with a system upgrade or a new electronic health record. And again, some of these things are, if you've ever been through an organization that has done updates in terms of different things, we have the Kubler-Ross phases of grief. Although this was written in terms of grief, in terms of the death of a loved one, you have other types of things, and we can push this model out to many other types of things, including change management in the workplace. This deals with denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and the acceptance. And then another model is the Kotter model. Kotter's change management model deals with urgency, coalition, and then note again, you see vision mentioned in these. The vision, the strategy, you have to communicate the vision. In other words, where are we going to be with their idealized state? We need to eliminate resistance to change, the short-term wins, and then consolidate the wins, and then adopt the change. And again, these are just models, not to say that they happen in every single workplace. Senge has the theory of change, talking about the learning organization and then system learning and things that contribute to it. And again, this is another model that is useful. One of the things when we implement new technology, whether it's electronic health information, voice activated transcription, or some of these other systems, is we have to train people how to use these systems. and have references available and all these other things. And in healthcare, this is a particular challenge because we're 24/7, 365 days a year. So how are you going to reach that type of gap? And of course, we wouldn't have a model unless we have an acronym. So here it is. It's the ADKAR. ADKAR is the awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, reinforcement. The Bridges model, pretty straightforward. Again, there are all different types of ones, and by no means is any of this a comprehensive list of all the models that you see when you talk about change management. All different types of books, journal articles written on these. But some things that need to be addressed are the organizational culture. And one of the things that we do to assess organizational culture is surveys and the work environmental scale. And so basically what we need to do is to look at what do people value. And you see some examples of this even here at LCC, where we send student surveys out. We want to gather data. What do students value? How can we make the student experience better? And if we know what students value, then when we do have change and we have to manage said change, we have a role of how can we get this across to our students, to our patients, to our providers, whoever we're working with change management. And then communication and change management, basically, it's a lot more than a web page. All of us have worked or been associated with organizations that say, well, it's on the web page, and then you can't find it. Communication isn't just pushing out information in a context or a URL on a web page. It also involves making sure people understand what's expected. And this is where the last bullet point of active listening comes in. We need to be able to listen effectively to make sure people are getting what they need. And with change management, a lot of this involves negotiation. And we went through a lot of this implementing electronic health record systems at Kaiser. People didn't want to let go of the paper records. Providers were wary about losing critical information, and you have to kind of negotiate things. So you have to kind of, example of a negotiation, we would say for certain types of appointments, we'll still send paper charts, and then we'll start slowly phasing them out after we're confident and the providers are confident that people have been fully trained and know how to use the system. And this involves collaboration, in other words, working with people rather than just pushing change and new systems and new workflows down people's throats. And with collaboration, we have to look at some of the things that are barriers to effective collaboration. For instance, with providers, a lot of people are very uncomfortable dealing with physicians. They're intimidated by them because of their status, because of their hours, all these other things. And this is an issue that is addressed. One of the things you can do is have physician leadership be involved with this to create a more collaborative environment. Inevitably we'll have conflict. Conflict means that we will have two different opposing views. And people always think of conflict as a negative thing, but a lot of positive things can come out from this. There are different ways individual people respond to conflict. Sometimes they'll collaborate and come up with an even better solution. One of the things that we see is rather than just telling people what to do, we get their involvement and come up with the solution that both sides work with and can live with. The other way is to just yield. And sometimes, as unpleasant as that sounds, people need to yield to the inevitable. Health information managers, physician providers, and others had to yield to the prospect of ICD-10 being implemented in 2014. There was no negotiation. There was no way to collaborate and work around it. It was mandated by CMS and it was coming and it was implemented. The other thing that they do sometimes is things need to kind of related to yield. If you're on the one side of it and you're a provider and you're yielding it to a new coding system, you're imposing it, right? And this can come from leadership. This can come from external forces outside of the organization or what have you. And then finally, the last way people deal with conflict is they withdraw. You know, of one coder who basically decided to retire because she didn't want to be retrained on ICD-10. She was a very competent coder, but this wasn't for her. She was seasoned enough to retire, and she went ahead and did so. So one of the things we need to look at are these critical conversations, and these are outlined in your book and will be useful for you when you look at the case study. You need to talk about these steps for managing the critical conversations and state your role in them. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Bye now.